Hey guys, so this is the final chapter that we're going to go over before your quiz that is scheduled on Friday. You also have a current event due this weekend. This is going to be the introduction to public policy in Texas. When we meet on Wednesday, hopefully we'll be meeting on Wednesday unless, I have another issue. Um, we will be discussing education policy, and then next week we'll move into our discussion of immigration policy, fiscal policy, and probably a little environmental policy as well. So, why does public policy matter, especially when we're talking about state and local governments? Because it mainly affects your life far more than policy does at the federal level. Policies made at the state level are going to have a much more detrimental effect on your everyday life. And I think we've mentioned that a number of times throughout the semester, but it's especially true in the following areas that we're going to be talking about. So what is public policy? What is policies in general? It is the actions of government. Who gets what from government? How does it get spent? How does our fiscal policy get spent? How do we make money? Where do we spend that money, and different activities that are being regulated by the state government. A lot of our funds, the revenue, about 33% of our general revenue comes from grants and national government, so they contribute to our public policy funds, but really the regulatory aspect of public policy is administered at the state level and sometimes even at the local level. So this is where you're going to see a strong balancing or changing of federal power. And when I say federal power, I'm talking about federalism, right? Which is the division of power between state and federal governments. And so this has shifted pretty drastically throughout time, which I'm sure most of you guys, hopefully all of y'all, were familiar with from your federal government class. But depending on the state of our governments, sometimes the power will lie within the, that's my cousin, sorry, within the federal government. Sometimes it'll shift to the state governments. Currently, we are having more, the federal government is relinquishing a lot more control to the states, which has kind of been a consistent trend since about the 1980s. So moving forward, we have to kind of remember that when we're looking at the outputs of our government, we are trying to get people to modify their behavior, right? And so public policy is goals that the government have implemented that are usually, hopefully, backed by incentives or sanctions, okay? So consider a piece of legislation that's trying to get society to modify its behavior if it was not backed up by an incentive or a sanction. That is, if something wasn't encouraging you to behave in a certain way, or punishing you, so to speak, if you don't behave in that certain way. Chances are the policy would be substantially less effective if it wasn't backed by incentives or sanctions. Okay? And these policies are laws. Generally, these laws are passed by legislative bodies, regulatory bodies, or public agencies. It's a messy process. It's a very difficult process. There's a lot of influence, and there's 5 general steps to it: the agenda setting, formulation of a policy, adoption and implementation, followed by the evaluation of a certain policy. And let's go through those individually now. So, agenda setting is what we saw at the beginning of the semester, when a policymaker, in this case the governor, prioritizes specific problems that are germane to the state and putting that in a systemic agenda. And usually those problems are within the scope of governmental regulation. Okay, and what I mean by that is you have to find the problem or define the problem as being able to be regulated by government. Okay, so depending on how you look at something like the problem of poverty, is this a fundamental problem of limited income, or is poverty behavioral? Do people choose not to behave in a way that will help them or incentivize them to have prosperous economic success? That is, Does government feel as though the problem of poverty can be regulated by government because it is one of limited income, or is it something that can't be regulated by government because it's behavioral, in that people behave a certain way that causes them to be impoverished? Okay? If they believe that poverty, the fundamental issue of poverty, is because of people's limited opportunities, thus resulting in limited income, they might be more inclined to try and identify it as a systemic problem. However, if they believe that the problem of poverty is behavioral, it might take a back burner to other problems that they do believe have existing governmental authority, legitimate jurisdiction for government to regulate. Okay, so in this way, ideology really does play a role in what kind of problems are identified as being a legitimate jurisdiction of governmental authority. That's followed by the policy formulation, and these are solutions to that general problem. So if you look at the different areas that the government or the governor identified as being action items or things that were what he wanted to accomplish first and foremost during this 86th congressional session, the debate and the discussion between what are the solutions to that problem, what are the solutions to education funding or whatever the other emergency preparedness, those are going to be developed during the policy formulation. They'll be discussed and debated. How do we solve the problem of unequal funding for education? How do we solve the problem of emergency preparedness? Okay, that's discussed during the formulation phase. And this is also where you'll see a lot of interest group access, okay, where they say, hey, you guys are discussing how to fix this problem. Our interest group is involved in this, or we have a say, we'd like to express our opinion on it. This is going to be followed by the final 3 steps, the policy adoption. This is the formal approval of the proposed action. So we see any bill that has been passed is going to be formally adopted. So it has accomplished all of the tasks, policy, or the agenda setting, formulation, and adoption. And it is going to be following the implementation phase. Okay, this is going to be the actual piece of legislation that has been approved plan of action. Okay, and that moves into the implementation, putting that public policy into effect, giving it to the agency that is most equipped to handle it, to implement it properly at the stage. Finding a finally evaluation, and that is policies being determined whether or not they are successful or effective in the way that they hoped for. So, for example, they're looking for a way to have more equitable school funding. Okay, so they'll try and formulate a policy on what they can do, what the state government can do to make school funding more equitable. They will then adopt a policy or formally approve plan of action. They will then implement that by putting it into the hands of a bureaucratic agency. And then they will evaluate whether or not that plan has been successful by just looking at data and statistics. Have we a higher improved rating of educational success? Do students graduate? Do we have more equitable funding? Does the state of Texas provide more funds more equitably for the following areas, XYZ? Okay, and that's done through an oversight commission called the Texas Sunset Commission, and they will evaluate policies every 12 years to determine whether or not they've been effective or implemented properly. Okay, so moving forward, when we talk about the policymaking process, there's a component of rationality that needs to be kind of put in the back of our minds as we're thinking about the different ways to formulate policy and then implement that policy. And it's called rationality, in that we have a identified goal and we have to maximize the output of that with using the limited resources. So identify goals, aim at achieving them in the most efficient manner. Okay? So having the maximized governmental goal, a large goal with minimal resources. How can we achieve that using the most minimal resources that we can. Okay? So, for instance, we want to equalize school funding using the fewest resources as possible. And I think that's generally something that we do in our everyday life. Nobody wants to spend more money without having, everyone's trying to get the most benefit for their dollar. Nobody chooses to pay more for no reason, right? If you can find the same product, the same, every aspect of the product is the same, chances are you'd want to spend your money, the least amount of money for that product. You wouldn't want to spend more for something that you could get cheaper somewhere else. Finally, there's going to be different types of policy making. Redistributive policy, distributive, and regulatory policy. And these are the most popular types of policy. Redistributive is going to be moving benefits, usually money benefits, from one group to another to make an equalized society. Okay? Distributive moves the benefits to meet the needs of the group without targeting anyone as the source, followed by regulatory policy, or trying to limit or control the actions of a group or corporation. So redistributive policy might be something like the Robin Hood plan, moving the benefits or the money from one group to another to make it more equal. If the government is trying to provide more funds or responsibility to the educational funding, it would be more distributive. So that would be the government as the source, trying to meet the needs of a certain group of people. Followed by regulatory policy. Regulatory policy are things like environmental policy, trying to get people to behave in a certain way. Okay, so we're going to end this recorded lecture here, and we'll start on Wednesday with education policy in Texas.